Good morning, everybody. This morning we have the pleasure of hearing from Reverend Jushin Stephyn Butcher, who started his Buddhist journey over 25 years ago in the Tibetan tradition. He found his way to Hokyoji, where he became a student of Reverend Dokai Georgesen. Jushin received jukai in 2013 and ordination in 2017. He's currently Hokyoji's board president. He hosts a sitting group on the banks of the Choptank River in Cambridge, Maryland, where I'm not sure he still resides, but he'll clarify that for us. And he resides with his husband, dog, chickens, and garden. So take it away, Jushin.
All right. Good morning. So yes, we still officially reside in Cambridge. It's just the secondary residence that shifts around. So good morning. It's wonderful to be here with you all. It's gotten crisp here on the Eastern Shore. Choptank is a Native American word. It stands for the place of the big current. So we have a really wide river down the street, and the wind blows off of it, gets cold. So I've had to switch to a winter Koromo finally. A little too chilly. So I hope you are all doing well. This morning, I want to sort of share with you, it wasn't my original Dharma talk, which is always dangerous. I ran across a quote that it sort of hit me, and I thought, well, wow, that's kind of interesting. And then I decided I wanted to do a Dharma talk about that instead. And so I'm going to say this kind of in the Marcus Aurelius vein. It was a meditation. So the quote is, "Without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue consistently. We cannot be kind, true, merciful, generous, or honest." It's by Maya Angelou. And so this is sort of a meditation on courage, me sort of thinking about this quote and immediately feeling like, yeah, that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. We cannot consistently be kind, true, merciful, generous, or honest without courage. And then sort of thinking about, well, that's kind of weird. You never really hear anybody talk about courage in the Buddhist tradition. And a quick search of at least my electronic Pali dictionary, I could find no Pali word for courage. In fact, I had to sort of check to see if it was broken, because I'm like, well, that's weird. There should surely be a word. And then I said, well, okay, what is to go? And then Gachati came back, and this seems like the dictionary is not broken. So it's like, that's kind of odd. And I really had never really heard anyone talk about it before. So let me start out by saying, I'm going to kind of go through this. I'm going to talk about, what do we actually mean by courage? Kind of look at courage in the big, sort of what we definitely, we often associate with courage in the small. And since courage is associated with fear and pain, talk a little bit about why some pain is necessary, and then close out. So what do we mean by courage? So just really simply, courage is action in the face of fear. So for this particular one, because I happen to remember for the Stoics were really big on the virtues, identifying the main virtues as the kind of the main centerpiece of Stoic philosophy, is to define what the good life is and how do we get there. And the guiding star of the good life is the first part is in self-development, is develop the four virtues. And these are wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. They're the guiding lights. They define your character. So constantly working on it, on your character. And so courage is just basically that. It's action in the face of fear. It's related to bravery and heroism, although we tend to use these words synonymously and sometimes overuse the word hero. Bravery tends to be associated with spontaneous actions, oftentimes done without fear. When we think of bravery, somebody rushed into a burning building, not even thinking about the fear. So we generally associate these kind of actions with bravery. I'm actually going to leave heroism to the end, but courage is defined as action despite fears, with probably maybe a healthy, sometimes unhealthy assessment of the risks. Robert Heinlein said, courage is the complement of fear. A person who is fearless cannot be courageous. They are also a fool. John Wayne said, courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway, partner. So it's not courage or fear, it's courage and fear. And there's certainly big courage in our tradition. So just going back all the way to the Buddha and Gautama Siddhartha, and just the world that in the ancient world, this is about 500 BC, how just dangerous and violent, like we can't even begin to imagine what that level of danger and violence was like, especially in the subcontinent where you have like people are wild boars, tigers, snakes, scorpions, all kinds of things you have to deal with. And you're talking about people who, for the most part, are living in huts. And so there's no real good way to keep out the bugs or the snakes or the scorpions or other things. And at that time, that part of the subcontinent was still heavily forested. It's not anymore after 2,500 years of habitation. But it was heavily forested, and in fact, that's recorded in the Pali Canon of people going out into the forests. And I'll get to what is Dokai, one of Dokai's favorite sutras about going off into the forest later. But there certainly is that, and there's probably you can think about big courage as the Buddha's quest as well. Leaving, if we take the traditional story, it's you're leaving behind everything to become a wandering mendicant, and that certainly takes a bunch of courage and faith in the sort of the overall social system, that if you go out and become a beggar, there are going to be people who give food to beggars. We see it with Bodhidharma, assuming a Bodhidharma existed. But if we take Bodhidharma at face value, it took him, first of all, you're in India and you decide, what I'm going to do? I'm going to go check on these people in China. I'm going to go bring the latest teachings to the people in China. I think it's because of Attila the Hun, the land route is closed. So he has to go the sea route to China, and it takes him 2 years. Storms, everything else. So there, so talking about fear and hardship, I'm sure there were plenty nights that he was out on a ship, seasick, and wishing he would just kind of stayed at home. If we look at some of our greatest Zen ancestors during the Tang Dynasty, they come during or after the Anlushan rebellion in China. So China had grown so big at that time. This is about 750. Well, the Anlushan rebellion is 755 AD. Of course, the Tang Dynasty starts before that. It's expanding. It, like all such things, is going to start to collapse, and they start hiring mercenaries to police their borders and to keep everything together. And as Putin found out, you can't always trust mercenaries. And in fact, one of them, Anlushan, had become a favorite of a courtesan and then declared himself emperor. And there was basically a 10-year civil war in China, during which time, estimates vary, 26 to 66% of the population died. So either 1 in 5 or 2 in 3, or basically 3 in 5 died during the 10 years from the fallout of the violence and the collapse of the central government and famine and everything else. which had long-lasting repercussions. So there was about 53 million, and 13 to 36 million died. And those, our ancestors who either came during or after either Matsu, Shito, Hanshang, Huangpo, Linqi, Jiazhou, Yunmen. So all of these, when you talk about, all of them just being sort of, you picture them sitting there in Zazen, all of this other stuff is going around, and it's stuff that they have to deal with. At the time when people were in famine, a lot of people were coming to the monasteries and becoming monks so that they would have food. And, there's a lot of where our really, really strict monastic sort of regulations come from, because they're really trying to make sure that everybody's, if you're coming, that you're contributing. But this is, something all of these people are practicing with the loss of neighbors, parents, siblings, and all of that. And this is the same time that Shito has composed the harmony of sameness and difference. And when he said, when he's writing all this poetry, this is the world that he lives in. And then, of course, there's Dogen. So Dogen experienced a lot of personal tragedy in his life. And, that's not particularly unique in terms of, I think, prodding people on to seek the way, to be interested in Buddhism. But at the time that he is deciding to go to China, the trek across the Sea of Japan is treacherous, and people routinely die in the process. And then just also the courage it takes to go to, you go into a foreign land and you're trying to just figure out, there's surely there's some excitement there, but there's also like, how am I going to go along? How am I going to, is my quest going to be successful, and that sort of thing. So it sort of gives a different blush to the lineage chart when you're just thinking about all of these people in the train of not just when we think of, suffering and pain and those kinds of things, but also the courage that came later to continue on with, either creating the teachers or keeping the lineage alive, or just, working through their life circumstances and what was going on. And I think that's a good frame of reference for us, because certainly and just after the An Lushan rebellion, the new Tang emperor was anti-Buddhist, so there was Buddhist persecution and all of these people, and yet there's a flourishing. And this is a common theme. There's a lot of research that shows we tend to think of the Italian Renaissance as being at the peak of an economic boom, and it was actually came out of the trough of economic downturn. So it's very often the case that these kinds of things come out of hard times, not easy times. But we shouldn't let ourselves get sort of overwhelmed by these ideas of big courage, like I have to do big things. This is what it means to be courageous and heroic. There's small courage, and small courage is pretty much, well, in our day-to-day lives of just making everything better. I'm somewhat addicted to some of the productivity gurus. There's a few of them I follow. I think it's James Clear. He wrote Atomic Habits, and the idea is just to get 1% better. It's just like 1% improvement. He tells the story of the British cycling team a few years ago. It was just apparently horrible. Well, they were still world class, but relatively speaking, they were horrible. And what they just decided, they hired a new coach, and he decided to just small things. Just he had all the cyclists. They tried different pillows, and they all got to pick which pillow gave them the best night's sleep. And they that was the one they would take when they were racing. And they did, okay, which combination of heat and cold tended to help recovery? And they studied it. And it was all these 1%, like tiny improvements everywhere, just tiny improvements. And the goal, I think, was to win a Tour de France within 10 years. And they won it in 3. And then they did, I think it was 2 or 3 that were back to back. So that's the power of small improvement. It's a small side trip there, but it's small things, and it's the small courage, I think, where we generally are living our lives. Mary Ann Radmacher says, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the little voice at the end of the day that says, I'll try again tomorrow. Winston Churchill said, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. So we do face kind of these small challenges and fears every day. And so, we are helped by finding the courage to persevere in these things, not trying to find all the, it's like, not trying to get all the fears to go away. We'll return to that in a moment, but continuing on despite fear. And these fears can be really, and they're often irrational. We'll get to that in a minute too. But some of them are, they can be real. And again, this goes back to a healthy assessment of risk. But a lot, but they're just also small things. And we face, not to divide daily life and practice, but it's really kind of an interesting thing to practice a very, very, very minority religion in a largely Christian country. And you just think about like the sort of randomness of like, oh yeah, I'm going to be one of, thinking about Minneapolis, St. Paul, the populations, there's about what, 300,000? Maybe more in the city. I don't know, let's see. The internet will tell us. Population, Twin Cities. Oh, yeah, I was off by a lot. Well, oh, yeah. There's the city and the other thing. So the whole region is 3 million. So you got 3 million people. How many people do you belong to Clouds, MZMC, Compassionate Ocean? Yeah, proportionately very small number of people. And everyone thinks it's kind of weird and exotic, and it's like, ooh, you're a Buddhist. And then there's just the courage of facing the wall. Like our practice is just like, especially when you're in sesshin, but even just in your day-to-day life, remembering to practice. It's like there's a certain amount of courage associated. You just keep going with it, despite the fact that you might not feel like, and sometimes you're encouraged not to feel like it's actually doing anything. So that takes faith and courage as well. On the subject of fear, though, so that's an interesting, it's an interesting connection, though. So why is there really very little discussion of courage? And there is discussion of fear. So in the Heart Sutra, it says, and thus the mind is without hindrance. Without hindrance, there is no fear. Far beyond all inverted views, one realizes nirvana. So does that mean that the enlightened don't have courage either? Is like, do you need courage if you don't have fear? That's sort of the interesting question I was trying to come up with an answer for. I don't really know what I think the answer is. Maybe it's a different kind of fear, or maybe enlightenment is just courage 24/7. And this kind of brings us back to the original quote: without courage, we can't practice any other virtue consistently. We can't be kind, true, merciful, generous. That's certainly on more of the precept side of things. And it puts an interesting blush on the precepts, though. So are we sometimes afraid to follow the precepts? Like, why are we afraid to be kind, true, and especially in a consistent way, merciful and generous? I think in some ways, certainly in our culture, you might be considered weak, in some cases unmanly, or even foolish, because if you give something away, you might not have it tomorrow. There's certainly something here of a self, a big self, with a big S here, with fear, and maybe it's just a simpler definition of courage. It says just do it anyway. So this comes down to Dokai's, one of Dokai's favorite sutras. He quotes it all the time: fear and dread. Basically, the Buddha is talking about the mendicants, renunciants who are going off into the forest. And of course, there are wild animals there. There are wild boar and tigers and other dangers. And the Buddha is talking about, before I was enlightened, I used to have fear and dread every time I went into the forest to practice. Now he says he doesn't, but he was talking about the sort of the solution. His solution is just sort of to lean in. So you just keep doing it. He basically says, yeah, I'm sitting there, and when fear and dread comes, I just keep sitting. I don't talk about the 4 actions, right? Standing, sitting, walking, and lying down. Basically, if I'm just sitting and I get fear and dread, I don't do anything. I don't sit up, I don't walk, I don't run away. I just sit. And if I get fear and dread while I'm walking, I don't sit down. I just keep doing it. I just keep standing. I'm just doing what I'm doing. So that does sort of suggest that maybe just doing it anyway is the solution, even though courage isn't specifically called out. Another interesting sort of facet of this, though, is we talk a lot about suffering and the end of suffering. In a previous talk, I talked about the precepts and the 2 arrows. So briefly, there's the simile of the 2 arrows. The guy is shot by an arrow, and the Buddha then talks about the second arrow, which is the suffering, and saying, it's as if somebody shot by an arrow goes, well, who shot me, and what caste was he, and what was the arrow made out of, and who made the arrow, and all of that. And it's like, that's all secondary. You can't escape the first arrow, but we can escape the second arrow. The second arrow is basically the suffering, everything we add on to it. But that does sort of suggest that, and that sort of suggests that pain is not optional. I tried to suggest that perhaps the precepts were to keep us from generating some of that pain. So if we weren't very good at eliminating suffering, we might try to eliminate pain. and the precepts might help us with that. But it sort of turns out that pain isn't all that bad, or isn't always that bad. So learning, growth, and improvement requires pain. It requires doing something that you are not comfortable with. That frustration that you feel when you learn something new, that pain, that's a physiological response. If you're not in pain and or discomfort, then you're not learning, you're not growing. And so I have this trouble with my students all the time. They'll register for my classes, they'll go look at the syllabus, and they'll say, I don't know anything about Bayesian statistics. And I'll say, yeah, that's why you're taking the class. Like, why were you supposed to know why are you supposed to know anything about it? That's why you take classes. I I think this in my last 15 years of teaching, I think it's gotten worse. I think it's an unintended consequence of standardized testing and teaching to the test, grade inflation, and really kind of self-help gurus gone horribly wrong. So in the 70s, there was a lot of research about successful people. And what they found is that successful people have really high self-esteem. And so what they decide is we could make people successful by giving them high self-esteem. And that was sort of what is colloquially known, the participation trophy movement. But it turns out that the arrow of causation goes the other way. People have high self-esteem because they're challenged and they succeed and they're successful. So you can't just make people successful giving them a high self-esteem. And this is sort of a weird counterintuitive thing in some ways, because research has shown that students, and by that I just mean really all of us as students of life, you actually learn better when you attempt something and fail and then are given instruction. They learn the lesson better, they remember it better. Of course, my husband and I are always talking about, you can't tell anybody anything. So like you always try to give people the benefit of your experience, and it's like they're going to do what they're going to do anyway. But sometimes having had that failure and then seeing the context, and really what it is kind of seeing without actually trying to do it and failing, you don't have context for the solution that people are giving you. And we're really talking about like small improvements here. So the task needs to be just, within reach, but out of grasp. We're not talking about a complete 180 here, but we are talking about sort of, we need to be challenged to learn and grow, and that's painful. And that's another source of fear, and overcoming that is courageous. And that's another part of courage. So I would ask you, what is it you're putting off? And I have this trouble too. Like there are some hobbies and stuff, and it's really hard for me I'm trying to, my calligraphy is horrible. And the worst part there is, and it's probably not horrible, but the better you get, the pickier your teacher is. So she's like, well, you didn't do this quite right. And I go, I try. The other problem, she never sees the 5 other things I corrected. So it always ends up being one thing wrong. But there's sort of an aphorism that says if your goal is to be a good painter, there are 100 bad paintings in you. So get them out of you as quick as possible. And if you want to learn a language, there are 100 bad conversations in you. Get them out of you as soon as possible. And whatever it is, if you want to exercise, there are 100 bad downward dog poses in you. Get them out of you as soon as possible. And then it's a joke, but it's true. That, in the practice of, so people, and then the final thing to tie these back together, people often think the fear of being kind and the fear of public speaking or the fear of painting or speaking a foreign language they're kind of different, but they aren't really. There's some level of the same kind of fear, risk, ego, self in there. So I want to close a little bit now by talking about then the next step, sort of heroism, and where heroism fits. This is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. So it's sort of courage plus something larger than ourselves is heroism. Society grows great. This is a Greek proverb. But society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit. So in Courage is Calling. So Ryan Holiday and a few others are sort of responsible for the Stoic Renaissance in the West. They write a lot of the books. He's basically written a book about each of the four. I think the fourth one is coming out. Each of the four virtues. He has one, courage is calling. It's a great double entendre there. So like there is a call for us to be more courageous, but also courage is a calling, a way of life. So normally we think about courage as being something that we do in the face of our fears in order to then enjoy the results later. So it's very much related to delaying gratification. But heroism is associated with not being able to enjoy the results. So one of the examples, classic example, is the 300. Everyone, I don't know if everyone knows about the movie or sees the movie, when you have the Spartans going off trying to keep the Persians from invading. They are going to lose. Their goal is to keep off the Persians for a few more days, so that the city-states, nation-states of Greece can be rallied to the cause, which they're able to do, but at the cost of all of their own lives. So that's so heroism is then, I think, more associated with courage, knowing that we are not going to be able to enjoy the results of our delayed gratification. So we often hear the phrase, everyone is doing their best. Is everyone doing the best they know how? I think heroism means doing what's required, what it takes, which is sometimes more than what we think we ourselves are capable of, and sometimes does require, sort of extreme sacrifice. So I don't want to be Panglossian or Pollyanna about this. Courage is hard, and causes and conditions are sometimes against us. Plans don't always work out. There are situations where success might mean some 100% change, and it does seem rather daunting, and in some ways it might be impossible. But for those things where steady improvement is possible, I think we're called, and we can be called for, to be courageous, and required then, and also to be, when necessary, heroic. And that's it. I will open it up for discussion. The bell is tolling. I don't know if you can hear my alarm, my grandfather clock in the background. It just struck 11. Do you have any comments, Kim?
I just find the question of Buddhism not mentioning courage very interesting. And looking at the aspect of, if there is no fear, then you evaluate what must be done and choose the option that is of greater benefit, of higher value. And so I'm finding it an interesting question to muddle with. It doesn't mean that I have an answer, but it just allows a person to explore different things about how we feel fear, or when we need courage. And if there are two things in front of us, and one will help 1,000 people and one will help one person, and you choose the one that has 1,000. And so that's a situation without fear. You can evaluate your options and requires no courage necessarily, that you're just dealing with the question of which is most beneficial, and not necessarily to one's own self, but beneficial in a larger picture. Anyway, I will probably have some enjoyable time dealing with that question. So thank you for that.
Gozen, I am all about calling on people. I
Uh,
teach
Thanks.
university, so yeah, I know.
No, I enjoyed your talk. I like the idea of or what strikes me is the idea of training and practice and kind of familiarization, and that you can kind of rely on that when it comes to facing a situation and needing to be courageous in the face of fear, very much being present. I don't have a lot of experience in EMS, but the experience that I do have and the um, uh, more experienced people that I've worked with, very much have a handle on what circumstances are and the fear that comes up. And from my experience, it's just a reliance on your training and on your practice at that time to respond to that circumstance. What I don't quite have a handle on is the idea of zazen kind of being one with activity and right action or beneficial action when there is no fear, but there's also no courage, but there's also no self, and how we can live, how one lives their life in that space, and also uh, I don't think that that space is something that we inhabit, all the time. So it's constantly arising and it's constantly falling. Um, and how to be okay with that. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but
Yeah, it's so I guess so my interest, so this is a really good question, and maybe Carl will chime in as well. Uh, but I mean, it's certainly in the things I was reading, there was these distinctions between bravery and courage, and it seems with the EMS, like that training really puts it in the training really puts it in the if your training is good and you rely on your training, it puts you in the brave category. And then if fear comes up, then it really is in the courageous category, if you're going to kind of split hairs. Um, but mostly, I mean, I think we mostly split hairs because I don't think anyone's going to say getting out of bed in the morning is brave, but it is often courageous. So there's that. I think on the second point, yeah, I mean that you can get really wrapped around the axle on the no self thing. I think this is why I really like Zen a little better than just this is one of the areas where I think Zen has a little bit more on maybe the Theravada traditions, in that when Shito is talking about the harmony of sameness and difference, uh it's a super imposition of self and selflessness. Like there's always both of those things going on at the same time. Like it's not a true dichotomy. It's because it's like it's not actually two sides of the same coin. You can't look at the heads and the tails. It's always both of those things going on at once. I think I mentioned this before. Kazuaki Tanahashi, I took a seminar with him. And when he was painting the calligraphy for Hokyoji, I asked him, he was talking about the harmony of Same and Sandokai, and he was saying, he goes, it's the harmony, he called it the harmony of boundaries and boundlessness. And he said, because you need boundaries. So yeah, and it seems very fluid, so it will be situational, like what part. But you have to be able to be, I think, and that's kind of the hard part, right? That's the like, is it a switch that goes off and you never have to worry about it again, or is it a constant struggle? You have to be in a certain position where you can make that call, right, of where you are on that scale in any given situation, and not being reactive in doing it. Because I think you can be knee-jerk self-sacrificial as well. I mean, we're much more accustomed to being knee-jerk selfish, but I think you can be knee-jerk generous as well, without getting into the whole self-care issue, which might be a little overblown in some cases, but yeah, important. Kyoko?
Well, when I was listening, one of the phrases that came up, which I periodically realize myself, is the lack of better options. So yeah. Courage can look
That's a really good. Courage can look like a lack of better options.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, your mother giving birth to you and you figuring out how to walk is, the sort of the first grade of courage in a way, because there's lots of fear in all of those. Although one could question, when you're learning how to walk, whether really fear really comes into it.
Right.
It's just sort of this urge to get someplace, maybe more about a passion, to moving forward in some ways. So in some ways, we really can't live without fear. But I think it's very much like the self and no self thing, in the sense that both are always present, but you can't really, as a human being, you don't have the capability to really effectively navigate just one side or the other side. And so I think in some ways, I don't know, is courage relevant? and of course, practically speaking, yes. Overcoming fear or doing things in spite of fear or with fear obviously requires something. And maybe one of those we can label courage. So I know that if you don't have fear, actually, you are not only dangerous to yourself, but to other people. I mean, there are people that actually, it's like they can't feel, and so it's kind of like they can't be afraid of fire, and so it makes for an interesting, thoughtful experience, and I think it's. I kind of have a little footnote that says, keep courage in mind as an option, because I'm sure that it arises, but I may not think about it that way. Or I might get so immersed in the fearful state that whatever I'm doing, even if it's in spite of the fear, it's not, there's not clarity, there's not calm about it. So maybe that's closer to bravery. It's like we're out of good options, so how do we proceed? Things like that. Or options that we like. In any case, I think it's something that a little bit like fear, if you don't have courage, then it's really hard to end up being a happier person, or at least a person who is kind of attuned to the whole of life. That's all I've got.
No, but that's a lot. I mean, I like the one about, when you're a baby and learning to walk. I think it is a complete absence of fear. I don't think we get it. And I don't think we lose that until we hit 30, really. And there are a lot of, because again, it's kind of one of the sandboxes I play in is art, and in art instruction and art books, they're always talking about, yeah, we just draw when we're a kid. We don't worry about the result. And it's also interesting, and a side note that's like, at the same time, our symbolization is developing. So that's why we move away from realistic art, and we just draw symbols for things, symbols for houses, symbols for mommy and daddy, which is why doing realistic art is so hard. But then we also lose the ability to just make mistakes, and just to like, yeah, I'm learning, I'm making mistakes. But what was the other one you said? Yeah, because there's the I mean, I hate to say whether there are healthy fears and irrational fears, and some of them are like, I suffered from, I've mentioned before, I suffered depression in my 20s, and I did cognitive behavioral therapy, which is actually built on Stoicism, where you do these little things where you're like, well, I'm afraid to do X, and the typical one is public speaking. I'm afraid to public, and then you do this little exercise that's like, why are you afraid of doing public speaking? Well, because I might say the wrong thing or flub up and people will laugh. Well, what happens if people will laugh? Well, people will laugh, and I won't have any friends. I'm like, well, it'll happen if you don't have any friends. Well, if I have any friends, I'll die. It's like all of them always end up, and then I'll die. And obviously, some of these we've talked before. I wish Rushin was here, because we've talked about cognitive biases and things like confirmation bias and things like that. This is obviously one, but it's a deep-seated one, because I think in the old days, there was an evolutionary reason for this when we were running around in bands, and you needed to sort of toe the line and contribute, and you needed the assistance of the group to live, to survive, literally. If something bad happened, you didn't do the right thing at the right time, you didn't zig when you zagged, it might mean your own death, or being ostracized, or the death of the group. And we've just carried that with us to things that have nothing to do with that. Like,
Right.
making a bad painting is not the same thing as making a mistake and getting eaten by a saber-toothed lion. But our software can't distinguish without help. But there is help.
Well, it also occurs to me that I think one of the gifts that I've received from practicing Buddhism is the what is it? I'll just call it factors, the 7 factors that are helpful. And you start out with mindfulness, but the next thing is investigation. And oftentimes that's a huge help to giving rise to courage. Although maybe it has nothing to do with courage, in the sense that when you come up against something that's problematic, and you embrace it and investigate it, and you have some awareness of being able that that's an option, and then maybe, does it take courage to require that? In any case, it's a very powerful shift, because that can mean whatever's coming up, either happiness or suffering, or disappointment, those kinds of things, that you're steering your attention. And I don't know that courage and steering attention would be called the same thing, because somehow it just shifts it shifts the causes and conditions. It shifts the ground.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the 7 factors because one of the bhikkhus, I forget who it was now, in the recent online version of Tricycle, was taking the one size fits all meditative people to task because he was saying basically like, yeah, that he was like that just sitting with things and just acknowledging them, like, yeah, that's okay, but um sometimes you sort of need basically, he was saying, you need to investigate what what is happening to you is partially your fault. Essentially, he was saying like, your karma and intentions are partially creating this situation, and you should investigate why this is happening, and what role you had to play in it, which I thought was
Or at
interesting.
least consider the option.
Yeah, at least consider the option that you had a role to play in your present situation, which it goes back to, I'm definitely in the there is no free will camp, but um that you can be you can be your own causes and conditions.
You are.
You are your own causes and conditions. So it's like, there's a feedback loop that, if I do this thing now, then tomorrow, and again, that gets back into sometimes delayed gratification is hard, and maybe courage is the answer to that in the short run. And if we're all enlightened and we have no fear, then we don't need courage anymore.
Yeah. I think so. In a way, cultivating courage is what allows you to move forward. I remember when I created a sabbatical for myself, and then it was over. Time's up, and I had to decide what to do. And my now ex-husband was very interested in where I was with that. So he would periodically check in on that question. And when he would, I'd say, it's, not now, it's, I don't know. Let's not talk about it. And I don't know, maybe the 10th time he asked that question, he said, well, can you help me understand what your obstacles are? What do you need to make a decision? And that was a very brave question from my standpoint. It was also devastatingly helpful in identifying the fact that I was petrified.
Mm.
And, as soon as he asked the question, I realized not having fear would be that would be a criteria. Or really overcoming fear. So another way to understand that is having courage, but I really had to do that thing you put your finger on, or maybe it was Kim, to say, well, what is the fear? What is the fear? And as you said, immediately it was sort of like, I'll die under a bridge with, no friends, no home, and it'll be cold and miserable. But really, it definitely comes down to you would die. And that's actually pretty helpful when you realize that's actually what's coming up, is that it's life-threatening. And it's kind of like, well, once you can see it that way, then it becomes easier for it not to be the only thing that's happening.
And this sort of dovetails, because I think in my last talk, I talked about the Heart Sutra and not having fear. And it's like, well, okay, but what are we going to do in the meantime? It's like, in the meantime, we're going to have courage.
It's such a wonderful, non-fear is something that is non-fear. What is it that's in the Fukan Zazengi? But basically, it's that it's not an either or. There's another state of being. So I think it requires probably courage and help from my friends too.
That works.
really put my finger on things that I'm petrified of. Sometimes I stumble into it, and I get some help. But I think it would be a good time to stop.
Yeah.
If anybody else has a burning contribution they'd like to make. Carl, you haven't spoken.
He gave a note that said he doesn't actually have a microphone or video today. So
Oh, he has no microphone. Okay, right. I remember him saying that. I think he just uses the computer that has no microphone.
he does it on purpose. Is that?
I'm teasing.
Don't listen to the haters, Carl. Don't listen.
No, it's really, I feel deprived of not hearing from him.
Yeah.
All right. So before we end the talk, first of all, thank you so much, Jushin, for another interesting contemplation, and for everybody else for attending. There's a link in the chat box. Should you once again be willing to make a donation to sustain Hokyoji and its activities. What's coming up? Let's see. Just Sitting, one of our most popular retreats that has none of the usual things that accompany a sesshin or a meditation retreat, is happening on the 17th of October for, I think it's 3 or 4 days. I don't have the dates on that one written down. In November, we have a couple of interesting things. We have Mark Anderson leading a retreat called Naturally Awake, which he summarizes as a direct path to claiming your true nature. He's always an interesting person, I think. He's a creative Buddhist. And then the 16th through the 19th of November, Onryu Kennedy and Genjo Sam Conway will lead a more classic sesshin called Practicing the Way in This Very Moment. And that will actually also include the ordination of one of Onryu's students as a priest in training. And then we have our beloved Rohatsu, which Myo-O and I will be co-teaching again. And our emphasis or our exploration will center on the Four Noble Truths. I'm always amazed when I bring these things up. I always think to myself, really, again? And then I reflect on the fact that that's all the Buddha talked about. So there's probably a way for that to continue to be relevant and worth our time. Next week, our speaker is going to be me. So I'll be happy to see you in that context. Please remember, Jushin is the person that helps us make sure we have a Facebook and Instagram presence. So please send us things that would be good to post on those and help spread the word about Hokyoji. Okay, so let's close with the chanting of the 4 vows. Beings are numberless. I vow to keep them, to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Carry on, Buddhas, and hope to see you next week.
Everyone have a great day.
Or whatever day is available.
That's right. Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.